The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, what pollsters are learning about American concerns over COVID-19 and why politicians should listen. Why Wisconsin Republicans push to have an election in the middle of a pandemic. Plus, Bill Press talks with Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio about what we need to do now to protect the nation's working class. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. John Anzalone has been measuring the nation's political pulse for decades. He says during this pandemic, many politicians are out of step with what Americans really want. And we say hello to Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large for the Progressive magazine, also editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Examiner. Ruth Conniff, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Great to be here.
Nice to have you with us. The coronavirus pandemic, obviously, drawing a number of new battle lines in American politics. Many of them are playing out dramatically in your state of Wisconsin. For example, Wisconsin's Republican-controlled legislature filed a lawsuit challenging Governor Evers' stay-at-home orders. What do Republicans want, and what's at stake here?
Well, Republicans want all the power in Wisconsin, is the short answer. So we have divided government. In our 2018 statewide elections, every office that was up was won by a Democrat. And yet the Republicans held on to their majority in our state legislature, both houses. And that's because we have, according to one federal judge, one of the very most gerrymandered maps in the nation. So the Republicans have the legislature. And as soon as Governor Evers was elected, they began to seize his powers. Before he took office, and while they still had Republican Governor Scott Walker in office, they passed a series of laws trying to take power from the executive and delegate them to the legislative branch. And so really what's happening in our pandemic election cycle is a continuation of that lame duck power grab. Today, there were oral arguments before the state Supreme Court. The legislature is arguing that it was an abuse of power bordering on tyranny for the governor to shut the state down during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they believe that that is their power, or they are arguing that it's their power, and that therefore the state Supreme Court should immediately overturn the safer at home order in Wisconsin, let everybody go back into the streets, and let the legislature work out what the plan should be through a Byzantine rulemaking process that involves the approval of a committee. The minimum amount of time that it takes to go through that process is about 20 days. That's if everyone agrees, there are no objections, and the calendar lines up so you don't hit any weekend days. So really what you see is a threat to any kind of effective response to the pandemic in Wisconsin. And one of the most notable things I thought in the arguments, the oral arguments before the state Supreme Court today, was that the lawyer for the legislators was asked what would be the effect for Wisconsinites of lifting the order. And he didn't even mention illness or deaths, which are mounting in Wisconsin. He mentioned only power, and that the governor would have to come and sit down with the legislature and work out a plan. So it's almost as if the facts, and of course they argued when they took this court that fact finding didn't matter. There were no relevant facts in the case. And that's why they're going straight to the Supreme Court rather than to a lower court where fact finding is appropriate. They're amazingly blind to the real world circumstances that we're in here.
And while the numbers are still going up, correct?
Correct. Yeah. We continue to see more cases. And we have inadequate testing, like everybody, although we are escalating testing. They're now hoping by the end of May to test every single nursing home resident in Wisconsin, because, of course, nursing homes are a hotbed. We had a recent outbreak in 3 meatpacking plants in Brown County around Green Bay, which caused that area to be the most infected area of the state. It's we're in the same crisis that people are in nationwide. What's unique about Wisconsin is that the legislature is making this argument that it is somehow tyrannical, unprecedented, and outrageous that the executive would act. And yet it's every governor across the country. It's an executive action everywhere in the United States of America to try to control the pandemic. So their argument doesn't really hold water. And they're going off into this area that has to do with power and control, and their theory is that the legislature really has all of the power. It's not even the full legislature. First of all, who brought the case? The Republican leaders of the legislature. There are a couple of Democratic members of the legislature who put out a press release yesterday saying, we were never consulted on this. There was no vote. There was no discussion. The legislature as a whole is not actually bringing this case. So there's a question of standing, whether they even have the standing to bring the case on behalf of the entire legislature. But their remedy is to go through a committee on administrative rules. That's not the whole legislature either. It's a Republican-dominated committee. And it's as I said before, it's a slow and cumbersome process. And the language in our state statute that gives the power to the head of the public health department to do this state shutdown to stop the spread of infectious disease is very clear. She is empowered to issue a statewide order. So they're sort of ignoring that and insisting that it doesn't mean what it appears to mean, and it's not really the executive's power. So that's what's going on here in Wisconsin.
Wow. And it's and we're still early in the week. In another story that attracted national attention, Wisconsin Republicans fought any delay or moved to mail-in voting in Wisconsin's most recent election. Why did Republicans fight so hard on this one, even as it put voters at risk?
Well, they have been surprisingly upfront about that, in fact. The majority leader of our state Senate, Scott Fitzgerald, said at one point that having more people vote was bad for Republicans. And that, in fact, in an earlier effort to move the date of the state Supreme Court election off the date of the Democratic presidential primary, because both parties' presidential primary, but only one party has had a contested primary, that they wanted to move the date of the state Supreme Court election because it would give their conservative candidate a better shot at winning if they had a lower turnout election that did not involve the Democratic Party's presidential primary. They failed in that effort to move the election date. And so instead, when they were handed this surprise gift of the pandemic, they began to use that as an excuse to suppress turnout. I mean, it's, from their statements, it's pretty clear it was about voter suppression and it was about trying to win that state Supreme Court race. And they didn't. They actually didn't succeed. Partly, I think, because people were so outraged, including in Republican districts, about forcing people to the polls during a pandemic, which was clearly going to lead to more infections and more deaths.
Well, and here's the other thing, and I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of polling stations normally, in normal times for the state of Wisconsin versus how many there actually were the day of this election, it was in the single digits? Is it
nearly 200 in Milwaukee down to 5? So it was a very reduced access to voting. There were also a lot of, League of Women Voters volunteers who were over the age of 60 who were forced to choose between going to the polls and working as poll workers and taking their health and their lives in their hands. So a lot of poll workers didn't show up. The National Guard filled in for them in some cases. It was a disaster. People lined up for blocks with their masks on and voted anyway. And then there was the whole debate about absentee voting, the mail-in vote. And that is going to be significant for the entire country in the fall. Because in Wisconsin, at the very last minute, literally the night before the election, the U.S. Supreme Court changed the rules. They overturned a district court's ruling that people should have extra time to cast their absentee ballots. And there are various complications with absentee ballots. There weren't enough ballots. People had not yet received them, although they had requested them in time. People who were quarantined had to have a witness signature, And our state elections commission issued these incredibly complicated guidelines. Leave it outside, have a delivery person sign. Somebody has to watch you via Zoom, cast your vote in order to sign as a witness that you voted. You then mail you back that envelope, then you mail that envelope in. So despite all of that, the Supreme Court put a hard deadline. They did not allow another week extension on that process. They said instead that ballots had to be postmarked by Election Day, forgetting that in Wisconsin, many of these ballots that run through a meter and sent to people, so there is no postmark, which caused even more confusion.
Oh my
Local
goodness.
elections officials all over the state had to figure it out for themselves, and they made a variety of different rules as they went. But in the end, it was interesting. The Washington Post had an article today that, in fact, the U.S. Supreme Court 11th hour ruling, while it did limit things more than they were going to be limited, it extended the ability to vote to Election Day for absentee voters. Their ballot didn't have to arrive Election Day. It had to be mailed Election Day. And that caused an increase, I think they said, of about 30,000 votes that otherwise wouldn't have been counted. So that is now, it's something that the Democrats had opposed and the Republicans had supported. It was a Republican case. The Republican Party actually took that case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now they're going to try to go in the other direction. As we move into the fall, if we see a rebound, they're going to want to limit that mail-in vote so that it can't go all the way up until Election Day, because they see now that what that means is more voters. And the shorthand for both parties, they pretty much openly acknowledge this, is that more voters mean the more Democrats.
Right. Yeah. Now, as you wrote in a recent piece at the Wisconsin Examiner, quote, Wisconsin's GOP legislative leaders have more or less adopted the Trump strategy, refusing to lead and looking for a way to build up personal power during the pandemic while shifting the blame for anything that goes wrong, close quote. How do you understand this approach? Is it true political belief or merely political expediency?
Well, it is a window into the insane self-centeredness of Republican leaders who are so concerned about their power. I mean, it was one thing to engage in a voter suppression strategy that might intimidate people out of voting in the pandemic election here. It is quite another thing to be willing to throw out any kind of safer at home policy so that you can have the power over setting a future policy because you want to seize that power. That's actually going to kill people. So that's pretty far. They're willing to go pretty far. The point that I was making there is just that both Trump and the Republicans in Wisconsin have failed to come up with much of a plan and have been kind of flying by the seat of their pants, very quick to point fingers. And I see this strategy now unfolding across the country with all these reopen rallies. The Republicans, including Trump, are encouraging those rallies, a little bit tentative about participating themselves still, because what's the upshot going to be as we see infections spike and people dying? Being the party of death is kind of a weird political choice. But they're not sure, so they have a finger in the wind. They're not making the orders. They're not making the plans here in Wisconsin. Now, there are Republican governors who are also issuing these orders, as in Ohio. But
Right.
They're unwilling to take a lot of responsibility. They want to just make sure that the Democrats take the fall. And so what you see is not leadership. You see a desire for power, and you see a willingness to let things kind of fall apart for citizens. And I think ultimately that cannot benefit them. And I think one early sign of that is what happened in the state Supreme Court election here, where, their conservative justice, it's nonpartisan, but it's very, clear which side people are on. Their conservative justice lost. And I think part of that was a backlash against what we're seeing from the state Republicans here.
Mm-hmm. As you look at Wisconsin Republicans and Republicans around the nation, do they have a political choice? I mean, based on what you're just talking about, because we've seen what Trump does to people who challenge him.
Well, there's that, right? There's that. And then there's the question of how long is Trump going to be able to ride his gut into the next victory? I mean, he has an instinct. He has a strong instinct, and he has a lot of appeal to a very disaffected base. He sees these reopen rallies. They look like Tea Party rallies. Those are his people. He is halfway throwing in his lot with them. But I think other Republicans have to make a choice about whether they want to go down with the ship or how long they think they can ride that thing. And also just as human beings and neighbors and citizens and people who live in the states, what are they willing to do?
Yeah.
And a few, have taken a stand. Mitt Romney took a stand early. we'll see. We'll see how long people continue to support a politics that is really showing its destructive side in a big way now.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large for the Progressive Magazine, also editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Examiner. In terms of how a pro-Trump strategy works with voters, do you think it could backfire on Republicans in November? I mean, is there enough steam going on? I mean, does it seem to be what happened in Wisconsin's most recent election?
I believe so, as far as the state Supreme Court election went. I think when you look at vote totals, even in Republican areas where people who were Trump supporters voted against the conservative state Supreme Court candidate, you see people who were mad at the decision by state Republicans to force them to go to the polls. We'll see what happens. Everybody is sort of watching to see what happens with the pandemic. I went to one of the Reopen rallies. It happened to be in front of the governor's mansion, which is a few blocks from my house, and saw people who are out of work, who are mad at the governor for shutting the state down. But, the governor didn't create the pandemic. And so
Right.
Trump's strategy depends on making the Democrats seem like the ones who are causing the problem. If they succeed in Wisconsin, and listening to the arguments today, it seemed like they might, in forcing our state to reopen, people are going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And by the fall, those consequences are going to be more clear. So, it depends where we hit in the cycle, how things look, and whether people are motivated to vote. They were motivated by the voter suppression strategy and the pandemic election here actually to vote. They weren't, that it didn't turn out to be an effective effort at suppression.
Yeah.
So we'll see if that happens in the fall.
And if you listen to the scientists and the doctors, they tell you that there's a pretty likely chance that come fall and next winter, we see a spike back up without a vaccine. And of course, a vaccine, depending upon who you listen to, the doctors or the president, that's a year and a half, maybe a year if we're lucky.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, the idea of being forced to reopen is really scary.
Yeah.
Because it has made a difference.
Well, in terms of how progressive politicians should play the moment, in a recent piece like Common Dreams, you wrote that the longer the coronavirus emergency goes on, the clearer it is that a New Deal-style rethinking of our whole society is in order. Specifically, what needs to be rethought?
Well, we have a piece on our site, the WisconsinExaminer.com site today, about the food system by a retired dairy farmer here in Wisconsin. Dairy farms have been experiencing just an incredible crisis in Wisconsin, talking about how the weaknesses in our food system are exposed by the pandemic, that we really can't have this massively spread out system, that we need to nurture more local food supplies, and that then, every global crisis that we experience has this terrible domino effect, so that we have empty grocery store shelves. We're not nimble. We can't move to produce what we need to produce. We can't sustain ourselves in a more local fashion. So that's one example. I mean, college debt is another example. We have these students who are so burdened with debt and who are, graduating into the worst economy in recent memory. We have to really look seriously at that. I think all of the things that progressives have talked about for a long time in terms of building the kind of social infrastructure that doesn't allow people to just fall through the cracks is obviously needed. Healthcare, it's kind of tragic that we're going to make exceptions just for coronavirus to allow people who otherwise aren't covered to get their healthcare paid for, but not for anything else.
Right.
We have massive numbers of uninsured in this country, and we have to address it. And I think what's happening is that there's a whole generation of Americans coming up who are just not going to tolerate indifference to these issues because they are living them, because they're living on the edge now. And we need real leadership, and we have a real crisis. And the fact that we don't have real leadership in that crisis from the top is very evident, and it's scary. And it's an opportunity, I think, for people who are serious about leadership to step into the gap.
In light of the pandemic, do you think more Americans who do not see themselves as progressives will perhaps be open to new ideas?
Yeah, and I think that we've been moving that way for a while. I mean, I think, this was what Bernie Sanders said during his campaign, and he was right. In 2016, when he brought up a lot of the things that he brought up, free state college, universal health care, Medicare for all, which now has majority support in this country.
Right.
These were crazy ideas, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. All of this stuff, which is commonplace in other industrialized nations, should not be associated just with communism, in America. Americans should look at, what do we do as the richest country on earth to make sure that we have a humane society? Because it can be done. We just saw that Congress, under pressure, can appropriate $2 trillion in bailout funds. It turns out there's money available. It's a question of priorities.
And where it goes, because a lot of the wrong people were getting a lot of that money. That's a whole nother issue. That's probably a whole nother interview with you sometime to talk about. But before we let you go, what we saw with regard to the recent election in Wisconsin, Republicans are prepared to fight hard, obviously pulling out all stops. Voter suppression, certainly a part of their playbook. What do Democrats need to do to fight back?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the Democrats who are in the executive branch in Wisconsin right now are doing their best to appeal to the better angels of people's nature, to say this is common sense and we need these protections. I think that one of the things that our governor has been criticized for by the Republican leadership in the legislature is not reaching out and making plans with them. And that's a little bit hard to take seriously because, like Mitch McConnell, when Obama was first elected, they seem to have made it their goal to make him fail. But I think that behind the scenes, there is kind of a smart politics working with and building support from everybody. And I think that that's part of the strategy. I think talking in a way that addresses people's common interests is really important. Not isolating yourself, being aware of the degree to which, if you're representing values that really ultimately have majority support, it's having the courage of your convictions and really making sure that people understand that you're talking in a way that people can understand about the values that everybody holds in common. And, just being willing to lead, even if it doesn't look immediately expedient, because it's so needed now. And in the long run, that's going to be so clear.
Can you imagine how different things would be, how different our conversation would have been today had we had leadership from the top from the beginning?
I mean, it's really, really tragic.
Or even if it wasn't in the very beginning, even if it was just a few weeks late, whatever, it's still not there. And November can't come soon enough.
Yeah.
Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large for the Progressive Magazine, editor-in-chief of the Wisconsin Examiner, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Ruth, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why Republicans in Wisconsin forced voters to risk their health to cast a ballot. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
There's a general sentiment today that multimillionaire corporate chieftains are pigs. But I think that's unfair. To pigs, those oinkers are remarkably intelligent animals with a sense of social responsibility to the common good of the group. Compare that ethic to the ethic of self-entitlement expressed by pompous and petulant corporate executives like hotel magnate Monty Bennett, who recently grabbed millions of dollars in economic relief meant for small businesses. It was so stinky that even the thievish Trumpistas made him return the money. Yet, a shameless Bennett continues to insist that he deserves a government bailout. What are all those taxes we paid supposed to provide us with anyway, he whined. Well, Monty, maybe with a literate workforce, clean water, paved streets, fire and police protection, and other public basics that subsidize your business. But our taxes aren't meant to guarantee your profit. Yet, Bennett flaunts his cluelessness. I won't apologize for being a capitalist in America, exclaimed this socialist capitalist in March as he was grabbing taxpayer handouts. Indeed, he's apparently a very poor capitalist. Last year, before the coronavirus catastrophe struck, the Ashcroft Trust that he heads had a $113 million loss and saw its stock value nosedive by 80%. Yet, he took special care of himself, pocketing $5.7 million in personal pay. This is Jim Hightower saying, meanwhile, Monty is in line for more government money from Trump and Company's new $500 billion pot of cash exclusively reserved as emergency aid for giant corporations. Moreover, Bennett and his ilk can take this bailout with no requirement to use any of it to protect the paychecks or save the jobs of employees. They can even use our money to raise their own pay.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The pandemic is changing the political landscape in Wisconsin, and few know that better than longtime political journalist Ruth Conniff. She says Republicans are willing to sacrifice public health in the interest of holding on to power, but it may not work. And we say hello to John Anzalone, one of the nation's top pollsters and messaging strategists. He has more than 25 years of polling experience and has polled for the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. He is the pollster for 4 sitting governors, including Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. John Anzalone, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. COVID-19 pandemic, truly a remarkable moment in American history. Polling, of course, gives us the opportunity to understand how people feel about it, and you are our guide to the polls. Now, in a recent email you sent out summarizing the latest polls, you wrote that COVID-19 ranks as one of the most dominant issues Gallup has ever recorded since they started polling in 1939. What does that tell you?
Well, what it really tells you is that it's pretty scary shit. And I say that because everything that has ever ranked high in the Gallup poll in terms of the most important issue has been during difficult times. So the highest was 58% for the economy during the Great Recession in November of 2008. The second highest was terrorism at 46% after 9/11. And following that is COVID-19 at 45% now. So to rank high as the most important issue, it's usually a negative thing, including things like war. So not a good place to be.
Right. Yeah. The one place you don't want to be in first place.
Right.
So let's find out what Americans are thinking about. You reviewed a number of polls asking Americans how they feel about relaxing stay-at-home orders to get the economy moving sooner rather than later. What are pollers hearing on that issue?
Yeah, this is one where the American people are just way ahead of everyone, right? They're living it day to day. You have a lot of politicians out there who want to rush things. You've seen some governors like Governor Kemp in Georgia really opened things up very early. And voters just aren't there. I mean, literally 81% of voters in a morning consult poll said that we should continue the social distancing as long as it's needed to curb the virus, even if it means damage to the economy. And again, I mean, poll after poll has been really clear that Americans are more concerned about actually relaxing the home restrictions and that it would lead to either more deaths or a second wave than anything else. So they're not going anywhere, even if, like today, for example, you would have no restrictions. If states just said, hey, we're going to let you do all these things, there's only about 26% of adults, according to a Washington Post poll, who say they would actually go into a dine-in restaurant, or only 31% who say they would go into a barbershop or hair salon, or 34% who would go into a retail shop. So even for these governors who kind of are rushing things and not listening to medical experts, a majority, really a super majority of Americans aren't going to do them. But enough of them are going to do it to possibly create a second wave. And that's the problem.
I will paraphrase the Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, when he said the other day, post-protest at the State House in Maryland, where he said, sadly, there were more deaths today in Maryland than there were protesters.
That's right. And that's right. Yeah.
That's pretty chilling.
And we've seen, listen, you had mentioned Governor Whitmer. I mean, we've seen protests up there, armed protests,
right,
which is really, really scary. But, in the polls after that, 60%, said that they opposed the kind of the protesters, which tend to be, largely pro-Trump. There's a lot of Trump flags. There's a lot of, for some reason, Nazi flags, things like that. It kind of reminds you of Charlottesville. But the fact is that there's been plenty of polls out there that show almost 2/3 of Americans, or in those states, Michiganders, oppose the protesters. And, that even means, for example, slightly more Republicans oppose them than support them. So that's important.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's also been some reporting in the media that there's a red state, blue state divide on the issue, that red state residents are more skeptical of stay-at-home orders and the coronavirus itself than blue state residents. Are you seeing that in your research?
Yeah, it's public research. I'll tell you, I would love to drive people to a great article that Ron Brownstein wrote called "The Coronavirus is Dividing Blue Cities from the Red States," because it really dives into that. And again, you see Republican governors opening things up much quicker than Democratic governors. But for some reason, Republicans, self-identified Republicans, voters or Americans, just seem to be more willing to go right now out there. And there was I think a Gallup poll that said, hey, if government restrictions were just right now shut down and you could return to day-to-day activities, only 21% of adults nationally said that they'd be comfortable doing that, although 44% of Republicans said that. And again, in those statistics that I mentioned about what people are comfortable going out and doing, again, even though only 34% of adults are comfortable going to a retail shop, 53% of Republicans are. 41% of Republicans are more comfortable going out to a dine-in restaurant versus 26% of adults overall. So, it is just one of these things that we are in a divided country. And, whether it's President Trump or Republican governors like Kemp tend to drive some of their voters, unfortunately, in this case, kind of like lemmings over the cliff on an issue that could really hurt them.
I have said all along, if the message from the top, meaning the president, is different than what we've been hearing, if it's just cohesive, just everybody, we've got to come together and do all this at once, you and I would be having a different conversation today.
That's right. I mean, we've seen, President Trump's numbers underwater, a net negative on handling this crisis, while we see governors ahead. It's not unusual. For example, for Governor Whitmer, you've seen public polls where her job rating is in the low 60s. When you ask who do you trust more, governors or President Trump, by a wide margin, they're trusting the governors. But also, you've seen just statistics. For example, even though in states like Michigan, et cetera, that have big cities, you see higher death rates. What you've seen in the last couple of weeks is higher rates of people contacting coronavirus in these red states that have less restrictions. And that's a real problem because it has real impacts on people's health and lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, given that so many Americans favor continuing strict safety measures, how do you understand some of these decisions by governors? You mentioned Brian Kemp in Georgia, to ignore those sentiments. I mean, who are they really trying to please, and how much of a political risk are they taking?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a head scratcher because this is a guy who's not up until 2022, where you've seen leadership fill the void is the Atlanta mayor, for example, who again has held press conferences and has kind of countered his irrationality. One thing that people want, we find, is they want transparency and they want the truth. They don't feel that they're getting the truth from Trump. We've seen those numbers. Those are really bad for the president. And the fact is that, I think that is going to come and bite Kemp somewhat in the ass in the long run, especially if there's a second wave. And that is what people fear. Again, 2/3 of the people fear individuals themselves are going to not be responsible enough, and it's going to cause a second wave. And about 2/3 of voters believe that if their elected officials ease these restrictions too quickly, it's going to cause a second wave. And so voters are way ahead, or just Americans are way ahead of some of the elected officials here. And I think that they're going to be punished if there is a second wave.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We're speaking with John Anzalone, one of the nation's top pollsters and messaging strategists, today on the America's Democrats podcast. John, as Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's pollster, you had a front row seat as people rallied to protest her stay-at-home orders, and we talked a bit about this a moment ago. The pictures were disturbing. The armed protesters waving the Confederate flags and everything else. And you said to the New York Times that the right would only get louder as long as safety restrictions stay in place. But from a pollster point of view, does that work for them? I mean, what kind of reaction are you seeing to these displays of resistance to public safety?
Well, again, I think that the big thing is that most people in the state of Michigan and most people in the country are against these protesters. I think that the biggest thing that people want, and we see it in the data, is they trust medical experts, but they also trust elected officials who listen to medical experts. And so these people who sit there and go into these state capitals or protests, they're not getting a lot of sympathy from Americans or voters. There's really not a whole lot of people at this point in time on their side because they believe that there's still harm to be done because of the COVID-19.
Let's turn to the presidential election. How important is coronavirus in terms of how voters feel about the two candidates? Well, one definitely Donald Trump, and of course the presumptive Joe Biden right now.
Yeah, this can't be good for Donald Trump. He's up there every day in, hurting himself. We've again seen in a very short period of time when the coronavirus crisis started, there was kind of a rallying effect around Trump. And we saw that he actually had a net positive on handling it. And then he started doing daily briefings, and that immediately went away over a week or 10-day period. And now, again, he's kind of underwater. He gets a net negative job on handling. But more importantly, he gets a net negative on being trustworthy or telling the truth, giving good information, etc. There was a Monmouth poll that said 31% of voters say Trump's handling of the coronavirus outbreak had made them less likely to vote for him in his reelection. So, there will potentially be impactful electoral situation for Trump on that. There was I think a Marist poll that showed 55% of voters picked Vice President Joe Biden over Trump as the person who could best handle the coronavirus pandemic. So there is a sense out there that Joe Biden, who has handled crises for the Recovery Act, for example, or Ebola or H1N1, he has the experience to do this. I think the most striking number I have seen was by Morning Consult, who showed that voters over 65 early on approved of Trump's handling of the outbreak by a pretty big margin. And it didn't take too long to where they soured on him. And so they dropped a total of 20 points in a very short period of time. And it was seniors who moved away from Trump the most, 20 points. Trump won seniors by 7 points in 2016. They are the largest group of voters in the electorate. But guess what? They're also the ones that are most susceptible to coronavirus, as we also know. And so they're judging Donald Trump on his actions or inactions, his chaos, his not listening to medical experts, and it's going to hurt him with votes overall. But I think particularly with seniors.
3 years, and he has touted the greatest economy of all time, And in a month, it was gone. Does he have anything to stand on heading towards November?
Well, not a whole lot. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've seen in public polls is that the one thing, Donald Trump had a couple things going for him. And one was he was an incumbent. Two, people thought he was kind of a strong leader, right? He's kind of an alpha male, and he's, a decider, and he's, he takes charge even if you just don't like him. Well, the coronavirus and how he's handled this has now made his job rating on being a strong leader, or his trait on being a strong leader, underwater. And so he no longer has that. And so he's, again, in a way, pissed that away, because how people are viewing him is not listening to medical experts and kind of not taking this coronavirus serious at the beginning, and having a very chaotic way to deal with decisions around that. And so that has hurt him. And I think that will, again, permeate over to how people view his handling of the economy. And so we're in a little wait to see period on that. But the anxiety level among voters is very high. And the universe of voter who says they're in serious financial trouble or having trouble meeting financial obligations is getting higher and higher. And now we have basically almost a majority of people who think that we're either in a depression or a recession, and another plurality who believe that we're heading into a recession. Those aren't good things for a president whose calling card is the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we let you go, when a crisis is this big, long-lasting, there's a potential for a shift on basic attitudes about government and politics. What types of shifts are you going to be looking for?
Well, I think that we've seen one really big shift, and that is that voters or citizens are putting their trust in governors, right? Democrat and Republican governors. They just believe that governors have provided the leadership vacuum that Trump should have filled, or any president should have filled. And so I think that we're seeing a lot more trust in state government and state government leaders, Democrat and Republicans, over the leadership at the presidential level. In 2009, people were looking for Barack Obama and Joe Biden to take the economy out of the ditch. And they took the bull by the horns. They had a plan, and they did it. People didn't necessarily always agree with it, but by the end of the day, they were grateful to what those two leaders did, and they got reelected. And I think that Trump, having such a chaotic response, not taking it serious, is now going to be in jeopardy of his reelection.
Okay. Well, November's not that far away. We shall soon know the answer to the question. John Anzalone, one of the nation's top pollsters and messaging strategists, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. John, we appreciate your time. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for what you do for Democrats.
Appreciate it, John. Thanks, and stay healthy. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan about crisis politics and what's at stake for workers.
Tell us, what is the current status of the coronavirus in the state of Ohio? Ohio's been one of those states pretty badly hit.
Yeah, we're stable. Mahoning County, which is Youngstown, was the hardest hit in the state. But we were in very, very early with the stay-at-home orders, and Governor DeWine has done a good job of, keeping the state prepared and the early intervention. And so things are stabilizing. There's still a lot of cases coming in, and we got a long way to go. But for the most part, we prevented the healthcare system and the healthcare workers from getting completely overwhelmed. And flatten the curve, which I guess was the goal. And so, we're happy with that, but we know we still got a long way to go.
You think the Governor DeWine's been on top of this from the beginning?
Yeah, he really has. The president was calling this a hoax, and Governor DeWine was moving forward, preparing the state for what was to come, and, trying to penetrate the national consciousness, or the state consciousness that gets overwhelmed by the national storyline that the president was pushing, which I think made it a little bit harder for Governor DeWine. But he did a nice job, and I think most people were taking it very seriously. And he was always with his director of public health, Dr. Amy Atkin, who happens to be from just outside of Youngstown. So we're very proud of her. And they did a good job, and he showed a lot of courage and a lot of leadership. And now he's being pretty methodical with how we're at least having conversations about how we're going to come out of this thing.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you next. What are the plans for reopening in Ohio? I imagine it'll be gradual. What are the kind of steps that you see, and what kind of conditions do you think have to be met as we go along?
Well, it could look confusing, but I think there's a consistency within it. So he extended the stay-at-home order to May 29th. But at the same time, starting today and on Monday, he's beginning to slowly unravel for certain industries. So construction and some transportation stuff and manufacturing. If you can keep your social distancing and those kind of things, he's starting to open things up a little bit. And the goal here really is to see where we are in a couple weeks, which is why he extended the stay-at-home order to the end of the month. But in a couple weeks, we'll know if there's some significant increase in cases, because there's about a 2-week lag. It was interesting, 2 weeks after Easter, we saw an increase in some of the local hospitals, because people over Easter weekend were interacting with each other and not necessarily adhering to the stay-at-home orders in a robust way. So it was just uncanny to see 2 weeks later, boom, there's the increase. And so what we'll do now is, as this unravels, we'll know in the middle of May exactly what was there an increase? Was it still flat? What happened? And then reevaluate where we go from there. And I really think that's how this is going to go down for the states that are going to do it in a thoughtful way, is take modest steps because we don't have the testing, and see where we are in a couple weeks. And if things are okay, take another modest step.
And when you look across the country, Congressman, what's your evaluation of the role the governors have played, Republican and Democrat, compared to the role of the Trump White House?
Well, depending on the state, but I think overall the governors are clearly calling the shots here, and why the president wants that to be the case is unknown. Other than I think he doesn't want to take responsibility for anything, really. I mean, not just this, but anything.
Right.
And so the governors are being highlighted, whether you're the governor of Georgia or Texas or Florida, or Mike DeWine here in Ohio. And so they've been taking the lead. And I guess we're going to see. I mean, we're going to see what happens in a place like Georgia. But the problem is in crisis communication, the key objective to protect the public is consistency and thoughtfulness. And we've had anything but that coming from the White House. And I know people are tentative and hesitant to criticize him because he's the president and we're in the middle of the pandemic. But Jesus, I mean, just unbelievably immature and divisive, and in a time where we need to come together. And so that's frustrating too, because as you mentioned, how's it going in Ohio? Well, we're trying to do our thing, and then the president is like starting fires all over the place. He's slamming Nancy Pelosi, he's slamming governors, he's getting in a fight with people, he's getting in a fight with China at the time we need their PPEs to at least come to the United States, because he's not, he uses the Defense Production Act to help with meat production and won't do it for, certain personal protective equipment because him and his friends want to eat steaks. I mean, it's insane.
And the other thing, of course, is that this is costing states a lot of money. And the states are saying, we'd like some help from the federal government. Mitch McConnell says, drop dead, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're not going to give any money to the states. And the president says, well, we might give you some money if you end your sanctuary city policies in certain states.
It's insane, isn't it? I mean, and I can say this and to your audience because they're sophisticated and they understand this stuff. There is a behind the scenes, there is a long-term conservative agenda, and it's the Koch brothers and it's the Mercer family and it's all of these different families who've been putting money behind this thing for 30 or 40 years to how do you destroy the New Deal, basically. And they wait for opportunities and crises to happen, and then they move in. And it could be privatizing things during Hurricane Katrina. It could be, Cheney privatizing the military and then getting out to go run Halliburton. I mean, it's all of these things that they usually happen around a crisis. So here's the next crisis. And what do they come in and they want to let the states go bankrupt so that they could get into those pension funds and give all the working class people a haircut. If the local communities and cities go bankrupt, all of a sudden you got to renegotiate those union contracts in the city, and those are police and those are fire. And so this is their goal, to dismantle the Democratic New Deal state, and that means going after the unions, and that means going after union pensions and union workers, and eventually renegotiating union contracts with regard to the public sector. And that's what's happening here. Like, they make no bones about it. Now, most Americans may not quite understand that and can't understand why you wouldn't want to help the states and the locals. But what we have to do is get this message out, especially to police and fire, who sometimes aren't necessarily always voting with the people who are representing their economic interests around the bargaining table, and they may vote on some of the other issues, and they voted for Donald Trump. But when they see what's happening here, I hope they will take a second look at the Democrats who are looking to make sure that these local communities and states get the money that they need so that they don't have to take a haircut. They're not making a ton of money anyway. And for them to take a haircut on their pension, or for them their contracts to get renegotiated and their wages taken down because of Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, I would think that's something we need to communicate to them.
No, amen. Congressman, you and I have had many conversations on the Bill Press show over the years, and it's always been about jobs, about American workers. Given who you are and given where you come from, that's been your main drive. And now we see 30 million Americans out of a job. How do you assess that impact on the American economy? And are those jobs ever coming back?
It's really hard sometimes to get your head around this thing. I think every American at some point is we're at home and we're doing things around the house, or we're working from our home office, or whatever the case may be. But there are these moments where you're just like, I cannot believe what's going on right now. And you read 30 million Americans now, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. And so my sole purpose in life at this point is really what it has been, is how do we take care of these workers and make sure that, whether it's unemployment insurance, cash assistance bill for $2,000 a month for everybody who makes less than $130,000 a year. I just want to make sure that these families, the pressure on them, Bill. I mean, it's just that the stress level is so great, and we need to make sure as a country we don't just take care of the banks or the big businesses or whatever, which everybody needs help now. But these families, the veil got pulled back, and we talked about this, and everyone. And when I was running for president, people would say, well, what are you running on? I said, well, we're running on the economy, and we're running on jobs and wages and the economic squeeze. And people are like, well, how are you going to run on that? The stock market's, doing well and all that nonsense that we've been hearing. I said, no, people aren't doing well. Well, here you go. One paycheck, gets missed. And people's worlds start unraveling because the economy was not so secure. And I tell you what, Bill, you want to have a conversation that gets this half Irish, half Italian guy all fired up. Let's talk about what's happened in the stock market in the last few weeks while the rest of the country is in disaster mode. You want to talk about a complete freaking disconnect from reality. You got 30 million people that are filing for unemployment in a matter of weeks, and the stock market goes up dramatically. I mean, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, right. Such a disparity there between the two. It's just it is unbelievable. But Congressman, one of the things, and I was with you a little earlier today on your news conference. One of the ways that you've talked about dealing with this problem is what you're calling hazard pay, your legislation on that. How would it work? Who gets it?
So the bill we're introducing today, I'm supporting a bill with Congressman Matt Cartwright, who's one of our frontline members out in Pennsylvania. And there are basically two categories. One are the one group is healthcare workers. So that would be, hospitals, nursing homes. They would get an additional $18.50 an hour, up to $35,000 a year if they make less than $200,000 a year. The other group
is this on top of what they're?
Yeah.
If I can jump, this is on top of what they're getting now, right?
Correct. On top of what they're making now, right. And then the other essential workers who are non-healthcare related. So think cashier at the grocery store who's working all these extended hours and getting sneezed on and coughed on and all this stuff in the middle of this pandemic. They would get an additional $13 an hour. The same if they make less than a couple $100,000. I think it's like $25,000 or $35,000 a year that they would be able to make up to that amount. And it's just, look, I mean, the things aren't going round and round without these essential workers, whether it's in the food ecosystem or in the healthcare ecosystem, and we need to help them out, and they deserve what they're getting now. And I hope that we can get this passed.
Is this standalone legislation, or would it be part of the? Yeah. Whoops! There's your friend there.
Hey, home office. Well, there you go. It happens. Every interview I do. I get one dog bark. It's I'm batting 1,000 here. But yeah, well, it's standalone.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Bear and Buckeye. They get more press than I do. There's a UPS guy. Let him bark it out. They have not figured out after all these many weeks that guy is not going to hurt us, but they're doing their job. Good job, guys.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, it's a standalone bill, but obviously we want to try to get it into this next CARES package 2.0, and I think it would be really appropriate. And it's good policy, it's good economics, it's good demand side economics. But it's also, it's good politics too. I mean, we've got to let these workers know that there is a political party in the United States who appreciates what they're doing, and it's not about just sending them a check. It's about respect and dignity and appreciation. And there's no better way to say that in the middle of an economic and public health crisis than rewarding them for the risks that they're taking and the hazards that they're facing every day.
And Congressman, another group of workers who are definitely on the front lines and I would say deserve hazard pay are those workers in our meat packing plants. I don't know whether you have any in Ohio or not, but hundreds and hundreds of these workers have caught the disease. They work in such crowded conditions inside of those plants, unsafe conditions, I believe. Dozens of them have died. And you indicated a little earlier, President Trump says, I'm going to use the Defense Production Act to force those companies to reopen those plants and force those workers to go back to work.
Yep. Well, it's unreal, isn't it? I mean, if it affects, this is kind of the thing that I think people are slowly starting, and sometimes not so slowly, starting to see about this president. If it is directly going to interfere with his life, if it has anything to do with him, he's going to act to help himself. If it has anything to do with anyone else, whether they're frontline workers or needing the PPE or all of these other things, he doesn't want to act. It's the governors, it's the locals, and let somebody else do it, or it's China's fault, or anything. I've never seen anything like this in my life. And then all of a sudden, we're begging him to ramp up production for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And he all of a sudden uses the Defense Production Act for meat and steaks. And look, I like a nice steak as much as the next guy from Ohio. But my God, this is what you're going to really go out on a limb on. And it's just revealing who he really is. And I just think people are starting to really come to grips with that. And it's hard to believe that someone could be so self-centered in the middle of a crisis like this and blaming and all of that. And we talk a lot too. I'm from Northeast Ohio. We grow up, we have a sports culture, even if you don't play, there's people watch and pay attention to it and all the rest. And the idea of looking at him and his leadership through the eyes of anybody who's ever played in an organized sport, and think about your head Little League coach or the head college coaches or the foot pro coaches on any sport, and think, blaming, shaming, dividing the organization. Like, what kind of leadership is happening right now? And, the governor's this and the governor's that. Who the hell was the governor of Connecticut during World War II, right? Did Roosevelt be like, well, look, I know they built some submarines in Connecticut. Best of luck to them out there. If they need me for something, let us know. We'll be behind you. Think about that, right? Who's going to build the airplanes? Well, Ohio's going to build them. Okay, well, best of luck to them. I hope things work out. Really? It's just insane. Like, we're even having this conversation.
So the Congress is coming. Well, I'm sorry, not the entire Congress. The Senate is coming back to Washington next week. The House is not. Who's making the right decision here, Congressman? Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell?
I think it's appropriate for us to be a little bit cautious because there are increased rates in Virginia, in Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. And so the attending physician who works for the Congress, I think was recommending to most of us that it may not be a good idea given the age, quite frankly, of a lot of the members of Congress. I'm 46 and I'm bringing up the rear here. I'm the newbie. So I think it's appropriate, Bill. I really do. And we can reevaluate in a week or so and see where they are. Everybody who comes into the Capitol to work or to clean or to, sanitize, well, they're all from Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So, we've got to be a little bit careful about, telling everybody else in the country to adhere to, these public health requirements. And then we we flout them. So I think it's appropriate at the time. I hope the Senate's safe and everything else. And we could get a lot of work done, and we are getting a lot of work done remotely. I think like a lot of businesses and a lot of people who have found out in the past few weeks, man, you really can get a lot done with these Zoom calls and everything else. So we're going to continue to work it. And I just hope we can continue to act. I think it's important for the House to act first before the Senate. We were playing off the Senate's playbook in the last round, and we're begging for local government help and all the rest. If you're the first mover, you get an advantage, and I hope we can still move first, even though we're not in the Capitol.
One thing that I find curious, Congressman, is that we've had, 3 stimulus bills now to deal with the coronavirus, trillions of dollars. And they're talking about perhaps another one. And yet, most of the time when it comes to spending money for, schools or for infrastructure or for, I don't know, a new national park or for family medical leave, we always heard from the Republicans, there's no money. We're broke, right? The deficit. We can't just So I wonder, I think a lot of Americans wonder, where did all this money come from all of a sudden?
Well, it's all borrowed. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And the question really is, what does it cost if we don't do anything? What's the cost if we let the economy basically shut down? And that's what would happen. I mean, if we didn't give, the $600 or $700 billion to these businesses, they would all go under. And it's a hell of a thing to start back up a business than it is to just kind of, put it on the back burner, keep it warm, and then open it back up, hopefully in a few months. It would be 60 million jobs, of people that would be filing for unemployment. And you'd go right into a depression, and then you wouldn't send any money to the state or the locals, and we would be in a depression. And they would lay off, and they would lay off police and fire, and then it would turn into bread lines and cheese lines, and we would be back to 1929, 1930, and so the question is, what does that cost versus what's it cost to spend $2-3 trillion every few weeks to keep things going, just so the economy is still semi-running. And there, you could go through and do the math, and it would cost significant treasure and lives if we did nothing. And I know that's always a hard thing to say, but the problem we're having now, well, you actually see the American people when you're talking about unraveling the stay-at-home orders. They're against what the president is saying as far as like rushing back out. So it's amazing that even though we're not getting any leadership from Washington, D.C., from the president, that the American people are using their common sense. They think that the government should be spending more money to buttress the economy in both the private sector and with individuals and with public sector, and that we should not run out just yet and start interacting too much. So, but in the midst of a crisis like this, Bill, like, you need a president. It's like we're a family without. We're going through a crisis without a father. Like the dad's at the bar drinking, and we're sitting here trying to figure out how we're going to put the fire out. The house is on fire.
So, Congressman, I want to get to the politics of the day in just a moment. But one final question about this coronavirus epidemic. Look, we all know this is the greatest healthcare crisis, the greatest economic crisis of our lifetime. But we're going to come out of it.
Yep.
When we come out of it, do you think things are going to go back to being the way they were, or will there be any fundamental changes in dealing with income inequality or education or just treatment of American workers? Have we learned any lessons from this crisis? Do you think that maybe we'll start to do things a little differently?
Yeah, that's my greatest hope. I just wrote an op-ed for The Hill, and I that's exactly what I talked about, that I do believe that there is a shift happening in our culture right now. And the shift is around some pretty fundamental values that I think we've gotten away from. And that's the dignity of work. That's the appreciation for those people who we, maybe a couple months ago walked right by at the grocery store, checked out, didn't look them in the eye, didn't say hello, didn't say thank you, because we were in a hurry. Not that we were bad people, but we were in a hurry, and life was rolling on. And I think today I see it with my wife. My wife's a first grade school teacher, and the text messages that she's getting and her colleagues are getting from parents. I mean, you tear up, read them, because they're saying, I don't know how you do this with 30 kids. I can barely manage, homeschooling one or two of my kids, and you need to be paid more. And one was pretty cute that one lady said, this is actually your kid, and you need to come get him. So, the appreciation around teachers and the first responders and the frontline healthcare workers and all of these people is something that I think is really real. And we just got to hold on to it, because from that comes living wages, universal health care, making sure everyone has prescription drug coverage. These are the kind of things that come out of values that we have gotten away from. And so I feel like that's happening. You see what people are doing. I mean, we get a text message today from there's a neighborhood text message, and one of the people is collecting boxes of food for the food bank. And she just kind of activated our street. And the second my wife gets the text, I hear her, walking over to the pantry to fill up a box for her. And I'll run, when I'm done with you, I'll go run and put it on her front porch. That's happening all over the country. My God, let's please not let that spirit go away. And let's not let Donald Trump, put the kibosh on that thing. This is what America is all about. And I think we're going to move in a different direction. And I'll be damned if I'm going to go down without a fight, making sure that we do hold on to that.
Bill Press talking with Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. John Anzalone, Ruth Conniff, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.